Welcome to Calvin's Stories, where a man who built everything refuses to be erased. Enjoy.
My name is Ricky Carlson. I'm 50 years old, and 3 weeks ago I woke up from triple bypass surgery in a recovery room in Minneapolis, with a tube in my throat and the strange certainty that something was already wrong at home. I couldn't have told you what. The anesthesia was still moving through me like fog through a parking lot, and the nurse kept saying my name in that bright, careful voice they use on people they're not sure are coming back all the way. But underneath all of it, underneath the beeping and the cold and the dryness in my mouth, there was this small, clean knowing someone had been in my house. Someone had touched things they shouldn't have touched. I tried to ask about my son. I tried to ask about the piano. The nurse smiled and said rest. And somewhere across the city, in the living room, my wife Marianne had decorated 26 years ago. My only child was already loading her 1923 Steinway into the back of a rented U-Haul at 6 o'clock in the morning. I just didn't know it yet. Before I tell you the rest, I want to ask one thing. If you've ever loved someone who is no longer here, and you're listening to this voice tonight because the quiet in your own house has gotten too loud, do me a small favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because the stories we tell here are for people who have been left holding the bag by the living and saved, sometimes, by the dead. Drop the name of the city you're listening from in the comments. I read them. I do. And then stay with me. Because to understand how I ended up sitting on a dock in Duluth at sunrise, listening to a recording of my wife playing Debussy on a piano that no longer exists in my house, you have to go back to the morning. I came home from the hospital and discovered that the silence in my living room had a price tag on it. They wheeled me out of Hennepin County Medical Center on a Tuesday. My chest was held together with wire and staples and a long pink seam that ran down the middle of me like a zipper somebody had sewn shut in a hurry. Derek picked me up in his Jeep. He had flowers on the passenger seat, grocery store carnations still in their plastic sleeve, and he moved them to the back when I got in. And he said, "Dad, you look good. You look really good." And I knew right then that something was off, because Derek had not told me I looked good since he was 9 years old. And I built him a treehouse out of pallets from the post office loading dock. He drove me home the long way. He took Lyndale instead of the freeway. He kept asking me how the pain was, on a scale of 1 to 10. And every time I answered, he nodded, like he was writing it down somewhere inside his head. The house was the house. Marianne's house. She'd been gone 14 months by then. 2 years of pancreatic cancer followed by the long quiet afterward. And I had not changed a single thing. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen windowsill. Her slippers were still under the bed on her side. Her music therapy textbooks were still stacked on the bench by the front door where she used to sit and take off her shoes after a day at the rehab center. I walked in slowly, one hand on Derek's elbow, the other on the wall. And I went straight to the front room, because that was the room that mattered. That was Marianne's room, and the Steinway was there. Black and enormous and patient, the way it had always been, with the metronome on the lid, where she'd left it the last week she was strong enough to play. I touched the lid. I remember that. I touched it with the flat of my palm, and I said hello to it the way I said hello to it every morning, because Marianne had been gone 14 months, but the piano was still her. Somehow, still the thing she had loved most in the world, after me and Derek. It had been her grandmother's. It had come down through 3 generations of women who taught lessons in parlors to neighborhood children for $2 an hour. Marianne had played me to sleep on that piano more nights than I could count after the long shifts at the post office, when my back was knotted and my hands smelled like ink and rubber bands. She would play Debussy, always Debussy. Reverie and Clair de Lune and the arabesques, and the metronome would tick on the lid like a second heartbeat, and I would lie on the couch with my arm over my eyes and feel like the luckiest man in Minneapolis. The home health nurse was supposed to be there when we got back. A woman named Patrice, from an agency on Lake Street, scheduled for 4 hours a day for the first 2 weeks. Derek said she'd called and rescheduled for the morning. I said, okay. I was tired. I was so tired I couldn't have argued if he'd told me the sun was setting in the east. He helped me into the recliner. He brought me water. He set up my pillows, and he stood in the doorway of the front room, and he looked at the piano for a long second, with a face I couldn't read, and then he turned off the light and said, "Get some sleep, Dad. I'll handle everything." I slept for 16 hours. When I woke up, Patrice still wasn't there. Derek wasn't there either. I needed to get to the bathroom, and I couldn't stand up on my own. My artificial knee, the one I got after a German Shepherd, tore my route up in 2009. Won't lock without me bracing on something. And the recliner footrest is too low to push off from after chest surgery. I sat there for 40 minutes before I made it to my feet. I shuffled to the kitchen holding the wall. I tried to make toast and gave up because I couldn't get the bread bag open. I called Derek. He didn't answer. I called him again. He didn't answer. I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the calendar Marianne had pinned to the side of the refrigerator, still on the month she died, May of last year, with her appointments written in her small slanted handwriting, and I realized I was alone in the house. In a way I had not been alone since the day after her funeral. That was the first night. There were 2 of them before I understood what was happening. I want to tell you about Marianne now, because if I don't tell you about her first, the rest of this story won't land right. Marianne was a quiet woman. Not shy, quiet. There's a difference. She could hold a room with one sentence and then say nothing for an hour and still be the loudest person in it. She came from a hard family. Her father was a Lutheran minister in Hibbing who believed kindness was a luxury for people who hadn't earned discipline yet, and he treated his wife and his daughter like staff who'd shown up late. Marianne left at 17 with a bus ticket and a clarinet and never looked back. She met me at a postal workers barbecue in 1996. She was there because her cousin worked the Roseville Annex. I was there because I had nowhere else to be. She walked up to me at the cooler and asked if I knew any songs without words, and I said all of them. And she laughed for about 20 seconds. And 3 years later, we got married in a backyard in Bloomington with 16 people watching. She was 42 when Derek was born. We thought we couldn't have kids. We had stopped trying, stopped hoping, stopped talking about it. And then Derek arrived. 8 pounds and 3 ounces, screaming his head off in the delivery room at Abbott Northwestern. And Marianne held him and looked at me and said, "Well, here he is. We better not break him." I worked nights at the postal sorting facility for 23 years so she could finish her music therapy degree at the University of Minnesota. She graduated when she was 51. She walked across that stage in her cap and gown, and I sat in the bleachers next to Derek, who was 9 and squirming. And I cried so hard the woman next to me handed me her travel pack of Kleenex without saying a word. That was the kind of woman my wife was. The kind a stranger hands tissues to on your behalf. Because anyone can tell, just by looking at the man crying, that whoever he's crying for must be worth it. Derek didn't turn out like her. I want to be careful how I say this, because he's still my son. And the part of me that taught him to ride a bike in the alley behind our house will never stop being his father. But Derek turned out like Marianne's father. Not in the religion, in the math. Everything for Derek was math. What does it cost? What does it return? Who owes what to whom? Marianne saw it earlier than I did. She used to say, "Our boy keeps a ledger in his head, Ricky, and we are not on the credit side." I told her she was being hard on him. I told her he was just figuring himself out. He was 23 when she got sick. He came to the house twice during her chemo. Twice. Once for an hour. Once for 40 minutes. He was busy, he said. He had a job. He had a girlfriend. He couldn't watch her like that, he said. It was too hard. Marianne never complained. Not once. She would hang up the phone after one of his short, dutiful calls, and she would close her eyes for a minute, and then she would say, "Well, he loves us in his own way." And she would go back to whatever she was doing. But she knew. She knew before I did. And 6 months before she died, when I was at work, she drove herself in her Toyota Camry up Interstate 35 to a small town outside of Duluth, And she bought a lake house. With cash. With money she had saved for 30 years. A little bit at a time, from teaching piano lessons on Saturdays, and from a small inheritance her aunt had left her in 2004 that she never spent. She put it in her name only. She paid it off in full. She got a deed and a key. And she put both of them in a safe deposit box at the Wells Fargo on Hennepin Avenue. And she told me about the box, but not what was in it. She said it was just junk on a keychain, just some old paperwork. She said we'd deal with it someday. She died on a Wednesday in May. The hospice nurse came at 6 a.m. Derek came at noon. I sat next to her bed all night with her hand in mine. And at one point, around 3 a.m, she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "Ricky, you were the best decision I ever made." And then she went back to sleep. And a few hours later, she was gone. Derek arranged the funeral. He did a competent job. He picked a casket on the lower end of the price range, and he negotiated the catering. He stood at the front of the chapel, and he gave a eulogy about her dedication to her career. He didn't mention the piano. He didn't mention the way she used to braid my hair when it grew too long, laughing at me the whole time. He didn't mention that she made the best chicken and dumplings in Hennepin County. He talked about her degree and her certifications and her years at the rehab center. And then he sat down and he checked his phone. That was a year and 2 months before my surgery. That was the man who picked me up at the hospital. The second night alone in the house, I knocked over a glass of water trying to reach the lamp. And I sat in the dark in the recliner with my chest aching and my mouth dry, and I thought, something is wrong, something is wrong, something is wrong. And I couldn't get my mind to name it. The next morning, Derek showed up at 9 with a woman I'd never met. He introduced her as Tessa. She was tall and thin, and she smiled at me with all of her teeth and none of her eyes. She was wearing yoga pants and carrying a phone in a pink case. She said, "Oh, Mr. Carlson, Derek's told me so much about you. You poor thing. You must be in so much pain." And she sat down on the arm of the recliner, and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she squeezed. And I felt my whole body want to lean away from her. Derek said Patrice had quit. That was the word he used. Quit. He said she'd called the agency and said the case was too complicated for her, and the agency was finding a replacement. And in the meantime, Tessa was going to help around the house. He said it like he was doing me a favor. Tessa said she'd cook. Tessa said she'd organize. Tessa said her phone was almost dead. Did I mind if she walked around and took some pictures to send to her mom, who collected vintage interiors? I said, sure. I said sure, because I was tired, and because the man saying these things was my son, and because I had taken half a Percocet, and the room had soft edges. She photographed every room. I watched her from the recliner. She photographed the dining room with Marianne's china cabinet. She photographed the bookshelves in the den. She photographed the bedroom where my wife had died. She knelt down and photographed the baseboards. Of all things, the baseboards. And I remember thinking even through the medication that was a strange thing for a person's mother to want to see. 3 days later, I'd understand why Tessa kept photographing the baseboards. But that morning I just closed my eyes and let it happen. Because Derek was in the kitchen humming, and I had not heard my son hum in 15 years. And some sick old part of me wanted to believe he was humming because he was glad to be taking care of his father. I slept again. When I woke up, they were gone. The house was quiet. Too quiet. There was a quality to the silence that I couldn't place at first. A missing texture, a missing note in a chord that had been playing for 26 years. I sat up, I listened, and then I understood. The metronome wasn't ticking. Marianne's metronome. The brass one with the pyramid shape. The one that sat on the lid of the Steinway and ticked even when nobody was playing, because the floor in the front room had a slight slope, and the weight of the metronome's pendulum would catch the angle and drift. Slowly, click, click, click. All day and all night. a heartbeat I had not consciously heard in years, but had heard unconsciously every minute of every day since 1997. The metronome was silent. The metronome was silent because there was nothing for it to sit on. What I heard in that silence, where the metronome should have been changed, everything. I got out of the recliner. I don't remember how. I remember my chest screaming and my knee buckling and the wall under my palm. I walked to the front room. The piano was gone. The space where it had stood for 26 years was empty. The rug underneath it had 4 indentations in the pile where the wheels had been. 4 deep round dents in the wool, and the metronome was sitting on the floor next to one of them, on its side, like someone had set it down and forgotten about it. I lowered myself onto the bench by the front door, Marianne's bench, the one she sat on to take off her shoes, and I picked up the phone and I called my son. He answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "Hey, Dad, how's the pain?" I said, "Where is the piano?" He said, "Oh, the piano. The movers came yesterday and put it in storage. Climate-controlled storage. It's safer there while you recover. The humidity in the house isn't good for it." I said, "What movers?" He said, "A company, a reputable company. He had the paperwork. He'd show me later." I said, "Derek, I want it back in this house by tonight." He said, "Dad, you're tired. Take your medication. Get some rest. We'll talk about it tomorrow." And he hung up. I sat on Marianne's bench and I looked at the empty space, and I did not cry. I want you to understand this. I did not cry. I had cried a great deal in the last 14 months. I had cried in the shower, and in the car, and in the produce section at Cub Foods over a bag of green grapes, because Marianne had loved green grapes. I had cried until I thought I had used up whatever the body keeps in reserve for that. But I did not cry about the piano. Something else happened instead. Something colder. I sat there, and I thought very clearly, in a voice that was my own voice. I spent 23 years working nights so my son could sleep safely, and he sold his mother's piano before my anesthesia wore off. I knew. I didn't have proof. I had no receipt, and no witness, and no movers truck to point to. But I knew. The way you know your own name. The way you know which side of the bed you sleep on. He hadn't put it in storage. He had sold it. And the piano was the first thing, but it was not the last thing. Because a man who sells his dead mother's piano while his father is in surgery is not a man who is going to stop at one piano. The next morning, Mrs. Okafor knocked on my door. She lives across the street. She is 73 years old, and she came to Minneapolis from Lagos in 1981, and she has cataracts, but she misses nothing. She was holding a grocery receipt from Loon's. She said, "Ricky, I don't want to make trouble, but I saw something, and I wrote it down. Because at my age, you write things down." She said at 6 a.m. 2 days ago. A U-Haul pulled up to my house, and 4 men got out, and your son let them in, and they took the piano out, the big black piano, and they loaded it into the truck, and your son got into the truck with the driver, and they drove away. And she had written the license plate of the U-Haul on the back of her receipt, in pencil, in her small, neat handwriting. She handed me the receipt, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said, "I am sorry, Ricky. I am very sorry. Your wife loved that piano." I thanked her. I took the receipt. I put it in the drawer of the bench by the front door, under Marianne's reading glasses, and I sat down in the recliner, and I thought for a long time. And while I was thinking, the phone in my hand buzzed, and it was a text. And the text was not from Derek. It was from Tessa. It said, "The appraiser says the house is worth $310K. If we get conservatorship, we list by August." There was a winking emoji. 3 seconds later, it disappeared. She had deleted it, but I had already screenshot it. Because old men who worked 23 years in the Postal Service learn to document things faster than young women in yoga pants understand. I sat with that screenshot for an hour. I read it 12 times. The words got smaller and bigger and smaller again. Conservatorship. They were trying to take the house. They were trying to take my house. They had sold the piano first because the piano was easy to move. And the piano was Marianne's. And they knew, both of them knew, that if they could get the piano out of the house while I was bleeding on a table at Hennepin County, they could get anything out of the house. The piano was a test. I had failed the test by not noticing fast enough. And now, they were going for the rest. That afternoon, Derek came back with a man in a brown suit and a leather portfolio. He introduced him as a notary. He said, "Dad, just some paperwork, just to make sure your affairs are in order while you're recovering. Just routine." He set the papers on the coffee table, and he handed me a pen, and he said, "Sign here, here, and here." The papers were a conservatorship consent. I had worked for the federal government for 31 years. I know what a conservatorship consent looks like. I looked at my son. He looked back at me with a face I did not recognize. The notary had the smallest, tightest smile I have ever seen on a human being, and his eyes were on the door. Derek smiled at the notary. The notary did not smile back. I took the pen. I held it. And then I let my hand tremble. I let it shake the way a man's hand shakes when he has just had his chest cracked open and is on pain medication that turns the world into pudding. I said, "Derek, I'm sorry. I can't make my hand work. The pills make everything shake." Derek said, "That's okay, Dad. Take your time." I said, "Maybe tomorrow. Maybe when the medication wears off a little, I want to sign something this important when I can read it properly." The notary stood up immediately, like he'd been waiting for an excuse. He said, "Of course, sir, of course, we can come back." And he left so fast he forgot his pen on the coffee table. My hands weren't shaking from the medication. My hands had not shaken in 40 years. But Derek didn't know that, because Derek had never paid enough attention to his father to know what his father's hands did under pressure. That night I sat in the recliner and I did the math. The hearing date, when I finally got Derek to tell me, was 9 days away. 9 days. 9 days for my own son to legally take control of my body, my house, my pension, and my savings. On the grounds that the anesthesia from my surgery had left me cognitively impaired. He had a doctor lined up, he said, who specialized in post-anesthesia cognitive decline. A friend of a friend, just to do an evaluation. Just routine. 9 days. I had $11,400 in my savings account. I had a knee that didn't lock. I had a chest held together with wire. I had no lawyer, no money to hire one, no family except the son who was doing this to me, and no way to drive myself anywhere. I had a screenshot, a license plate written on a grocery receipt, and a metronome lying on its side on the floor of the front room. And then I remembered the safe deposit box. I want to stop here for a second, because I know some of you listening have been where I was sitting that night. Some of you have realized, in a quiet hour, in a chair in a house that used to feel like yours, that the person you raised has become a person who is calculating your value in square footage. If that's you, and this story is hitting somewhere it hurts, take a breath right now, and if you have a minute later tonight, hit subscribe so I know you're still listening. Now let me tell you what I did next. Because what I did next is the reason I'm sitting on a dock in Duluth this morning instead of a memory care facility in Brooklyn Park. I called the bank. I asked about Marianne's safe deposit box. The woman on the phone said yes, it was still active. The annual fee had been paid through the trust she'd set up before she died. I had not known about a trust. The woman said I was listed as the sole authorized party. She said I could come in any time. I asked her if she could mail me the contents. She laughed kindly. and said, "No, sir, you have to come in person with ID." I said, "Okay." I hung up. I sat in the recliner for another hour, and then I did the hardest thing I had done in 14 months. I picked up the phone, and I called Dale. Dale is Marianne's older brother. He lives in a town called Two Harbors, up on the North Shore. He is 63 years old, divorced, retired from the Coast Guard, and he has disliked me openly and consistently since 1998. He thought Marianne married beneath her. He thought a postal supervisor was not the right ceiling for his sister. He came to our wedding and didn't eat the cake. He came to Marianne's funeral and didn't speak to me. We had exchanged maybe 40 sentences in 26 years. I called him because I had no one else. Because the woman who would have known what to do was the one we were both grieving. He picked up on the fourth ring. He said, "Ricky." Just that. Ricky. Like he was confirming a delivery. I told him. I told him all of it. The piano, the U-Haul, the conservatorship, the notary, the text from Tessa, the 9 days. I sent him the screenshot while I was talking. I heard his end go quiet. I heard him set something down. I found out later it was a coffee cup. Dale set his coffee down without drinking it, stared at the screenshot, and said nothing for 40 seconds. Then he said, "I'm leaving now. 4 hours. Pack a bag. I'll be there by dark." He hung up before I could say thank you. He showed up at 8:45 that night in a gray Silverado with a topper on the bed. He didn't ring the doorbell. He used the spare key Marianne had given him in 2003, the one I didn't know he still had. He walked into the front room, looked at the empty space where the piano had been, looked at the metronome on the floor, and his jaw moved once, just once, a small muscular tick under his beard. He didn't say anything. He went into my bedroom and he packed a suitcase for me. He packed the things Marianne would have packed. My pills, my reading glasses, the cardigan she'd knitted me the winter before she got sick. He carried the suitcase to the truck. He came back inside and he looked at me and he said, "The bank opens at 9. We go there first, then we go north." I said, "What about the hearing?" He said, "You won't be there. You'll be 4 hours away. The hearing happens without you." I said, "Can I do that?" He said, "You can do anything, Ricky, if you're not in the room when they try to do it to you." The next morning, we went to the Wells Fargo on Hennepin. Dale parked in the lot on 6th Street and walked around to my side of the truck and held the door while I got out. And the cold November air came up under my jacket and caught the seam in my chest like a finger pressing on a bruise. I went in alone. He waited in the lobby in a plastic chair that was too small for him, with his hands folded on his knees. The way men fold their hands in churches they have not been to in a long time. I showed my ID at the teller window. The teller was a young man with a careful tie and a name tag that said Marcus. He looked at my driver's license, then at me, then at the license again, and his face did the small kind thing faces do when they recognize the name of someone who has died. He said, "Follow me, sir." He took me to a small private room with a long table and a single overhead light, and the light buzzed faintly, the way fluorescent tubes buzz when they are on their last 6 months. And he brought me Marianne's box. It was gray metal, small, the size of a loaf of bread. The lid had a number stamped into it, 417, in a typeface I had seen on filing cabinets in the back of the post office for 30 years. I opened it with the key Marianne had called junk on a keychain. The hinges gave a small dry sound. Inside was a USB drive, a small black one with a plastic cap, an envelope with my name on it in her handwriting, and a thick folder of legal documents tied with a piece of brown twine she had double-knotted. The way she double-knotted everything, because she didn't trust single knots in this world. The folder contained the deed to a property at an address in Duluth I had never heard of, paid in full, in my name, transferred from a trust she had created in March of the year she died. 3 months before, she went into hospice. While she was on chemotherapy, with her hair falling out in clumps on the bathroom tile, while I was driving her to appointments, and pretending we both believed in the treatment. She had bought me a house. She had moved money I didn't know we had into a trust I didn't know existed. She had paid off a lake house in Duluth, and she had put my name on it, only my name, and she had hidden it in a safe deposit box for the day I would need it. I sat in that little room with the overhead light buzzing and the paper smelling faintly of the cedar she had kept in her desk drawer, and I held the deed in my hands, and my heartbeat monitor would have spiked if I'd still been wearing one. I read the address twice. I read it a third time. I touched the raised notary seal at the bottom of the deed with the pad of my thumb, because I needed to feel that it was real, that the small raised circles of the stamp were actually there, that this was not a thing the medication was doing to me. I did not open the envelope. Not there. I wanted to. My hands wanted to, but Dale was waiting outside in the truck, and the hearing was in 9 days, and I knew that whatever was in that envelope was going to take me apart, and I needed to be somewhere quiet when it did. I put the envelope and the USB drive in my coat pocket, the inside pocket, the one over my heart, because some old superstition from my mother's people told me that was where you carried the things that mattered. I put the deed in the folder. I closed the box. I took the folder out to the lobby. Dale looked at the folder. He looked at me. He said, "What is it?" I said, "My wife bought me a house." He didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at the floor. He looked at the door. He looked back at me. Then he said, "That sounds like Mary Ann." And he stood up, and he held the door for me, and he started the engine. We drove north on Interstate 35 for 4 hours. I watched Minneapolis disappear in the side mirror. I watched the suburbs thin into pine. I watched Hinckley and Sandstone and Moose Lake slide past. The sky went from a flat winter white to a thinner blue, the kind of blue you only see north of Duluth in November, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it, but has, somehow, no cruelty either. Dale didn't talk much. He turned on the radio once, found a country station, turned it off again. He drove with both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way they teach you in driver's education, and the way nobody actually does after they turn 19. Around Carlton, he said, "You hungry?" I said no. He said, "You should eat." He pulled off, and we sat in a Hardee's parking lot, and he handed me a biscuit and a coffee in a paper cup with a thin plastic lid, and he watched me until I ate half of it. The biscuit was warm. The coffee was bad in the specific way road coffee is bad, burnt and weak at the same time. I ate the half. He nodded once. Then he started driving again. We got to the lake house at 1 p.m. It was small. White clapboard, a green metal roof. A screened porch facing west toward the water. The dock was 20 yards from the back door, weathered planks running out over the shallows on creosote pilings. And there were 2 Adirondack chairs on the dock, gray with weather, the slats curled slightly at the ends from years of sun. The key from the safe deposit box opened the front door, and the door swung in on a hinge that squeaked one short note, a single high syllable. And inside there was a couch and a kitchen table, and a bed already made up with a quilt I recognized from Mary Ann's mother's house, the one with the small, repeating pattern of pine cones in cream and green. She had set it up. Sometime in those last months, when I thought she was resting, she had driven up here and made the bed and put dishes in the cupboard and a coffee maker on the counter. She had put a tin of Folgers next to the coffee maker. She had stacked 4 white mugs upside down on a clean dish towel. She had set up a home for me to escape to, and she had done it while she was dying. I sat on the couch. The cushions were stiff in the way cushions are stiff when they have never had a body sit on them. Dale brought in my suitcase. He set it down in the bedroom. He stood in the doorway and he said, "You want me to stay tonight?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." He went out to his truck for his own bag. I took the envelope out of my coat pocket. I sat at the kitchen table in front of the window that looked out at the lake and the lake was a flat, gray plate with a thin skin of November on it. And I held the envelope in both hands, and I looked at Marianne's handwriting on the front. She had written, simply, "My Ricky." 2 words, her loops on the Y, the small careful slant of her letters, the blue ink, slightly faded, from the cheap pens she insisted on buying in packs of 10 at the drugstore, because she said expensive pens made her self-conscious. I had not seen her handwriting in 14 months. I traced it with my thumb. I opened the envelope. The paper inside was cream-colored, slightly textured, the stationery she had used for thank you notes for 20 years. The letter was 4 pages long, written on both sides of 2 sheets, her small slanting script crowding toward the right-hand margin the way it always did when she had a lot to say. I unfolded it. The first line said, "My Ricky, if you are reading this in the kitchen of the house I bought you, then the worst thing I was afraid of has happened, and I am so sorry. And I am also so glad you found your way here." I had to stop. I put the letter down. I stood up. I walked to the sink. I turned on the water for no reason. The pipes thumped once and then ran clear. I turned it off. I sat back down. I picked up the letter. "You have always thought I was being unfair about our boy," she wrote. "You have always thought I saw the worst in him because I saw my own father in him. Maybe I did. But I saw something else too, Ricky. I saw the way his eyes moved when he looked at the piano. And I saw the way he asked about the house deed, the Christmas, before I got sick. And I saw that he was not asking because he wanted to know about us. He was asking because he was counting. I hope I am wrong. I have prayed in my way to be wrong. But just in case I am right, I have done some things, and I want you to know what I have done and why. I bought this lake house with money my Aunt Greta left me in 2004, and money I have been saving from piano lessons since 1998. It is paid for. It is yours, not ours. Yours. I put it in a trust because I did not want Derek to find it before you needed it. If you never need it, then you have a quiet place to fish in the summer. And that is a gift too. But if you do need it, Ricky, if our boy ever treats you the way his grandfather treated me, go here. It's yours and only yours. Do not let him in. Do not give him the address. Do not feel guilty. You did everything a father can do. You worked nights for 23 years, so he could have what we did not have. If he chose to count instead of love, that is not your debt to pay. The middle of the letter was about the piano. She had known, she wrote. She had known he would take the piano, and she was sorry. And she wanted me to understand that the piano was wood and wire, and the music was somewhere else. The music was in me. The music was in our years. And a man with nothing was not a man without music if he had ever once been loved. She wrote that the metronome was the part that would hurt me most. And she was sorry about that too. She wrote that she had thought about taking the metronome and hiding it, but in the end she had decided not to, because she did not want to live the last months of her life rearranging the house to protect me from something that might never happen. I want to be wrong, she wrote, twice on the same page. I want so badly to be wrong. I cried for a while. I am not going to describe it. There are some things even a man telling his own story should keep for himself. The last page said, "Ricky, you are the best decision I ever made. I told you that the night I died, and I'm telling you again now, from wherever I am, because I am afraid you will forget. You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to leave him to his own consequences. You are allowed to spend the money I left you on a new chair and a good bottle of wine and a fishing rod. You are allowed to start over. You are 50 years old, and you have at least 30 more years of life, and I want you to live them. Live them, Ricky. Live them for both of us. I love you. I have loved you since you said you knew all of them. Marianne." I sat at the kitchen table for an hour after I finished reading. The light moved across the water. A single duck came in low across the lake and skidded to a landing about 30 yards out, sending a long arrow of ripple back toward the dock. Dale came in at some point, looked at me, looked at the letter on the table, and went back outside without saying a word. I heard him on the porch, splitting kindling against the side of the wood box with the back of a small hatchet, the dry, sharp sound of a man giving another man some room. The lake went silver and then gold, and then dark. I sat there until I couldn't see the page anymore. And I want to say something to you right now if you are listening. If someone you loved left you a message you haven't opened yet, open it tonight. The dead don't write twice. And tell me in the comments what you'd want that letter to say, because I will read it. I will. And because I think there are a lot of us, more than we know, walking around with envelopes we are too afraid to open. The hearing was 6 days later. I did not attend. Dale found me a court-appointed attorney through legal aid, a young woman named Priya, who took the case on a Wednesday and had everything she needed by Friday. She called me on the porch phone. The old beige rotary Mary Ann had bought at a garage sale because she liked the sound of the dial, and her voice was calm and quick, and she did not waste a single word. I sent her the screenshot from Tessa. I sent her Mrs. Okafor's grocery receipt with the U-Haul license plate, photographed against the white of the kitchen counter so the pencil would read clean. I sent her the contact information for the pension administrator who had flagged Derek's fraudulent call, a man named Walter, who had worked with me in 2008 and remembered my voice. I sent her my discharge paperwork from Hennepin County stating no cognitive impairment. She filed a sworn affidavit on my behalf, attached the evidence, and made one phone call to the judge's clerk. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. Derek arrived with the notary and his friend of a friend, doctor. The doctor was not asked to speak. The notary was not asked to speak. Priya told me later that Derek opened his mouth twice and closed it twice. And the second time, the judge held up a hand without looking at him. The judge dismissed the petition with prejudice and referred Derek to the county attorney's office for investigation of attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. I was on the dock when Priya called to tell me. I had a coffee in my hand. The sun was coming up over the lake. The mug was warm against my fingers, and the porcelain had a small chip on the lip where Mary Ann must have set it down too hard one time, years ago, in some kitchen I never saw her stand in. I said thank you. I hung up. I did not feel triumph. I felt the particular tiredness of a man who has just watched the thing he was afraid of dissolve into paperwork. 43 seconds passed before I lifted the mug again. The coffee had cooled in that time. Just slightly. Just enough that I noticed. I let the silence sit on the dock between me and the water. Derek called me 40 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let it go. He called 11 times that day. The voicemails moved through the stages. First confusion. Dad, what's going on? Please call me. Then performance. Dad, I'm so worried about you. Where are you? Are you safe? Then anger. Dad, this is ridiculous. You can't just disappear. We need to talk. Then bargaining. Dad, I'm sorry. I know I made some mistakes. Can we please just sit down? Then a final one, late that night. In a voice I had not heard from him since he was a teenager. A voice with the bottom worn out of it. Dad, please. 3 syllables and a long breath, and the soft click of the line going dead. I deleted them all. I did not block him. I just stopped answering. The silence I gave him was the same silence he had given his mother for 2 years while she was dying. And I had no more words for him than he had had for her. I had rehearsed this silence for 6 months without knowing I was rehearsing it. Tessa left him within 3 weeks. I heard about it from Mrs. Okafor, who heard about it from the mail carrier, who heard about it because Tessa had filed a change of address. The new address that the mail carrier, Sawyer said, was in Edina, in a building with a pool, and a doorman and a name on the awning. The Minneapolis house was still mine. I had not put it up for sale. I had not done anything with it. I had simply walked out of it with my suitcase, with Dale, with the deed in my coat pocket. The estate sale Tessa had been planning never happened because there was no conservatorship and no asset to liquidate. The pawnbroker who had bought the Steinway for $8,200 refused to return it when Derek tried to buy it back, because Derek had signed a final sale receipt and the pawnbroker had already listed it through a dealer in St. Paul for $31,000. I do not know who has the piano now. I have stopped trying to find out. The piano is wood and wire. Marianne told me so. Derek lost the house, the piano money, the girlfriend, and according to my old neighbor, his job, because his employer found out about the county attorney's investigation through a background check renewal. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment in St. Louis Park. He has called me by my count 147 times in the 18 months since I came to Duluth. I have answered exactly twice. The first time was at Christmas, 6 months in, when he called to ask if we could talk. I said, "Derek, you sold your mother's piano while I was in surgery." He said, "I know, Dad, I know. I was in a bad place." I let the line sit quiet for a moment. I said, "I know." And I hung up. The second time was on the anniversary of Marianne's death, when he called and I could hear in his voice that he had been drinking, and he said, "Dad, I miss her." And I said, "I miss her too, son." And I hung up. That was all I had. That was all I have. The brother-in-law who didn't like me for 26 years drives down from Two Harbors twice a month. He brings groceries in brown paper sacks from the small store in his town because he doesn't trust the bread at the chain places. He fixes things that don't need fixing. He tightened the hinge on the screen door my second week here, and then he tightened it again a month later. And last week, I caught him standing on the porch with a screwdriver in his hand, looking at it like it might be due for another. He sits on the dock with me, and he doesn't talk much. And I've learned that Dale's silence is not the same as Derek's silence. Dale's silence is a man keeping you company. Derek's silence was a man counting the seconds until he could leave. There's a world of difference between those two silences. It took me 50 years to learn it. I sit on the dock most mornings now. The lake is called Pike Lake. It is small. There are loons on it in the summer, and they make that long curving call that sounds like a question being asked of the sky. The Adirondack chairs that were there when I arrived are still there. I have not replaced them. I have, however, learned which one is mine. The left one. The one with the slightly higher left armrest, where I can rest my coffee without it sliding. I drink my coffee. My chest has healed. The pink seam has faded to a thin white line that I sometimes forget is there. Hvor det en skaflejde rører zor in war or I were our from a mirror. My knee still doesn't lock right, and probably never will. I take my pills. I read. I've started teaching myself to fish badly. Dale laughs at me. A woman who runs the small grocery store in town has started saving me the day-old bread because I told her I like to feed the ducks, which is a thing I have apparently become, a man who feeds ducks at 51. Her name is Esther. She is 68 years old, and she lost her husband 4 years ago. And she does not flirt with me, and I do not flirt with her. And that is the most peaceful kind of friendship a man can have with a woman at my age. Marianne would have laughed at me, the duck part. Marianne would have liked Esther. I found the USB drive a month after I moved up here. I had forgotten about it. It was in the bottom of the safe deposit box envelope, slid down inside the lining where the paper had separated from the cardboard. I plugged it into an old laptop Dale brought me, a Dell from 2014 with the letters worn off the A and the S. There was one file on it, an audio file, 47 minutes long. The icon was a small, gray musical note. I hovered over it for a long time before I clicked. I clicked, and my wife began to play Debussy on the piano that no longer exists in my house. She had recorded herself sometime in the last year of her life, on her phone, sitting at the Steinway in the front room in Minneapolis. I could hear the metronome ticking on the lid. I could hear her breathing, that small, careful breath she always took before the first chord, like a swimmer before stepping off a block. I could hear, at one point, the heater kicking on in the basement, that small, low rumble I had not noticed in 20 years, and recognized instantly. I could hear a car go by on the street outside, a car with a loose muffler that I half recognized as the neighbor's old Buick. She played Reverie. She played Clair de Lune. She played the first arabesque, the one that always made me think of water. She played a passage twice because she missed a note the first time and laughed, just a small huff of air through her nose, and started again. And then she stopped, and she said, into the phone, "Ricky, if you find this, I love you. I will always love you. Don't forget to eat." And then the recording ended. I sat on the dock, and I played it on a small Bluetooth speaker, a cheap blue one Dale had picked up at a gas station outside Cloquet, and the sun came up over the lake, and the music came out of that small plastic speaker and went over the water, and the water did not care, and the loons did not care, and the sky did not care. But I cared, and that was enough. I smiled because the music was beautiful, and then I cried because the pianist was gone. And both of those things were true at the same time. And I think that's what life is in the end, for those of us who have loved someone all the way. Two true things at once: beauty and absence, gratitude and grief. A piano you can't get back, and a recording you didn't know existed. I used to think love was loud. I used to think the people who said it the most were the ones who meant it the most. I was wrong about that. I was wrong for a long time. Love, the real kind, is the woman who drives 4 hours to a town she has never seen to buy you a house she will never live in, because she has done the math on the man she raised, and she does not like the answer. Love is the brother-in-law who disliked you for 26 years and showed up in 4 hours anyway because his sister would have wanted him to. Love is the neighbor who writes a license plate on a grocery receipt, because at her age you write things down. Love and trust are different things, and I learned that too late. But not so late that I couldn't use what I learned. If you are listening tonight and there is a person in your life you have been carrying because you are afraid of what it will mean to set them down, I want to tell you something. You are allowed to set them down. You are allowed. Marianne told me so in a letter she wrote while she was dying. And I am telling you now, from a dock in Duluth, where the loons are getting ready for fall. That's the story. One piano that left the house at 6 in the morning. One envelope on cream-colored stationery in a safe deposit box. And one recording of a woman playing Debussy for a husband she knew would need it. If any of that landed somewhere in you tonight, drop a comment and tell me about the person who saw you when no one else did. Hit subscribe so the next story finds you. And if you have an envelope somewhere you have been afraid